Good morning. Today is Wednesday, the fourth day of Teves. And today we begin, and we finish actually, with the whole chapter 5 in the Tanya. Now this chapter 5 is a little bit out of the regular structure. We got used to the Alter Rebbe started the Tanya in a very systematic structure of explaining the godly soul, the animal soul, as you know, to see the whole map of the Tanya. We see in the beginning, the first chapter, the Alter Rebbe tells us about the two souls that we all have, each one, and chapter 2 explained what is the godly soul. And then he went on to explain about the different faculties of the godly soul. In chapter 4, the Alter Rebbe explained about the garments of the godly soul, which is the thought, speech, and action of the godly soul. And then he went on and explained that the garments of the godly soul, the thought, speech, and action in the Torah, studying the Torah and doing the mitzvahs, in a way, they are even higher than the soul itself, because the thought, speech, and action of the Torah is one with Hashem himself. Being that the Torah is one, the Torah is God's will, and is one with Hashem, therefore it is even, in a sense, even higher than the soul itself, being that the soul is, although being a part of Hashem, but it's not one with Hashem like the Torah itself is one with Hashem. Torah is like the Torah and the mitzvahs, like the organ of Hashem. So whenever we study Torah, whenever we do the mitzvahs, we become one with Hashem. And we ended yesterday, in the end of chapter 4. Alter Rebbe explained the idea of being embraced by the king and embrace the king. And this is now something that the Alter Rebbe goes and dedicates a whole chapter explaining this concept. That in a way there is something about knowing Torah but studying Torah, which creates a unity with God unparalleled in any other mitzvah. A unity that we are encompassing, and we are being encompassed. We are surrounding God's wisdom, so to speak, and we are being surrounded by it at the same time. What does that mean? This is what the Alter Rebbe now is going to explain in this chapter 5. So we're going to look inside and explain as we go along. To understand this, the Alter Rebbe is going to explain a statement that it says in the Zohar, from a statement by Eliyahu Hanavi, that he said that Leis machashava tfisa bach, there is no mind, there's no thought that can grasp Hashem. This is what the Alter Rebbe says. We need to, in order to understand what we are talking about, we need to understand the term grasping Hashem. So he says as follows. Well, Teves biur begins Alter Rebbe chapter 5. Teves biur by reitev lashoin tfisa. A further explanation to more fully elucidate the expression of tefisa, grasp. Sha'omar Eliyahu, in the words of Elijah, Leis machashava tfisa bach chulu. No thought can grasp you. And as the saying goes, Alter Rebbe explained, no thought can grasp Hashem, and the only way that it can be grasped is through the Torah. So the Alter Rebbe is going to explain this concept, the idea of being grasped. Why is it called grasp? So first of all, this is a term that can be explained in any intellectual experience. So he says, in a kol seichel, keshem maskil or masig besichloi eizu muskal. When any intellect perceives and understands some intellectual subject, araya seichel Teves es samuskal umakife besichloi. The mind grasps that subject and encompasses it. And in the same time, ve'amuskal nitfas umukaf umulubash b'teicha seichel sheyisigoi ve'iskilei. And the subject is grasped and encompassed by and is clothed within the intellect and understood and perceived it. The gamma seichel melubash bemuskel b'shah shemasigoi v'teisei b'sichlei. Also, the intellect is clothed within the subject at the time of intellectual comprehension and grasping. Now, what does that mean? Simply speaking, so when you have an idea that you are trying to understand this idea, at that moment, you can say, when your mind is in the idea, meaning there is the subject that you're trying to understand, you put yourself completely in it. So your mind is in the idea that you're trying to understand. So at the time when you're trying to understand something, your mind is in the idea, in the subject. So basically what it means is that the subject is encompassing you, surrounds you, because your mind is in the subject. And after working very hard and trying very hard to understand the subject, and you go through and you understand it from every angle, then you can say, I got it. What does it mean, I got it? It's in me, it's in my mind. So the idea now is in your mind. Now, what happens when you go again and you visit the subject again and you dig yourself again in it? At that time, you have both things at the same time. Your mind is in the idea and the idea is in your mind. This, the Alter Rebbe is going to say, is a way, a unity that there is no parallel unity in any other physical thing. Something that you can say you become one and you're becoming clothed and clothed in, you are in it and that thing is in you. This is something you can only say about an intellectual idea. And we'll understand further that when it comes to the Torah intellect, that unity is even stronger than just a regular intellectual idea. Continues the Alter Rebbe. Berech Mashu. It says, by way of analogy, for example, Kasha-Adam Mevin Umasig Ezoi Alacha B'Mishnah B'Gemara LaShura Al-Buriya. For example, one understands and comprehends a particular halacha, a law, in the Jewish law, in the Mishnah or Gemara, which is the part of the oral law, clearly and thoroughly through strenuous application of his mind. You put yourself really to understand that well. So his intellect grasps and encompasses that halacha, that law, and his intellect is also clothed in it at the same time. when he tries to understand it. Now here is something special. Now, being that this halacha, this law that you study, you don't study a law because someone came up with that law. You study the law that God in his Torah decided that this would be the law. So what are you studying? What are you encompassing? What are you putting yourself in? What is your mind in? And what is in your mind? God's will, God's wisdom. Says the Alter Rebbe, "V'inei halacha zoi ichachmasai u'retzainoi shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu." Now this halacha is the wisdom and will of God. The rationale underlying the halacha is God's wisdom, and the ruling itself is God's will. And this we learned in previous chapter 4. And what is God's will? She'olah b'rtzainoi, it arose in His will, in God's will. שכשייתן ראובן כך וכך דרך משהו, ושמעון כך וכך, יהיה הפסק ביניהם כך וכך. It was God's will that if Reuven, for example, Reuven would claim thus, and Shimon thus, such and such should be the verdict between them. Even if it never did, nor never will come to pass that litigation occur over these arguments and claims. It could be in the Torah, sometimes you have arguments and claims that it will never happen. Nevertheless, this is God's will. You are studying God's will. Yet since it arose thus in God's will and wisdom, that if one person would claim this way and the other that way, the verdict be such and such. Therefore, when one knows and comprehends this verdict, as a halacha set forth in the Mishnah or Gemara, the Talmud, or Poskim, the halachic codifiers, which of course the Poskim, they take all of the rulings, they derive it from the Talmud, from the Mishnah. He then actually comprehends and grasps the will and wisdom of God. That wisdom of God, whom no thought can grasp, nor can any thought grasp His will and wisdom. And the only way you can grasp it can be slapshusam ba'alochos aruchos lefanenu, except when they, God's will and wisdom, clothe themselves in the halacha set before us. So what is the Alter Rebbe saying here? That this union that happens here, when you study God's Torah, and what kind of Torah, what part of Torah says. If Reuven says this, Shimon says this. You know, the Torah has many different parts of the Torah. You have the laws of holidays, you have the laws of karbanot, you have the laws, many, many different laws. The Alter Rebbe chooses here those laws that apply to arguments between people, which called in the Shulchan Aruch is called Chosh and Mishpat, the part of the laws that deal between litigations between people. Why does the Alter Rebbe choose this particular part of the Torah? The Rebbe explains, but here, in this part of Torah, you're dealing with the lowest level. You're dealing with arguments between two people that argue, which obviously one of them is lying. One of them says this, the other one says this, and you have to make the decision who is telling the truth, or one of them is lying, telling the lies. Nevertheless, the Torah, God's wisdom, enclosed itself into this part of Torah, even in the lowest part that involves also people not telling the truth. And yet, when you study this Torah, when you understand this Torah, and you understand it deeply, and you connect deeply to it, that becomes one with you. You encompasses it, and it encompasses you. Your mind is in the Torah, and the Torah now is in your mind. And this is such a unity that we don't have any parallel in any other mitzvah. And of course, we have to understand, as we mentioned many times, that there is certainly advantages in doing mitzvahs also. Mitzvahs, all doing the actual mitzvahs at the end of the day, is the ultimate will of Hashem to refine and elevate the lowest part of the world through the mitzvahs. But here the Alter Rebbe focuses on the fact of the unity that is created. A unity that is created between a human being and God is something through the study of the Torah, is something that is unparalleled in any other mitzvah, as the Alter Rebbe will soon say. So this is what happens. So your mind is encompassing the Torah. V'gam sichloi melubesh ba'em. His intellect is also clothed within them, within the divine will and wisdom contained in the Torah. His mind is encompassed by them. And this is the Alter Rebbe, v'hu yichud niflo she'ein yichud kamoyu. Now, this is a most wonderful unity in the physical realm. There is no unity similar or parallel to it. Meaning of two things as disproportionate as human intellect and the Torah, God's intellect. That they should actually become one and united from every side and angle. You see, when you hold, let's say when you hold something, let's say you hold a piece of paper in your hand. You hold it in your hand. You're not united with it. You're not become one with it. You just encompass it and you hold it. Here, when the mind connects with the Torah, you become one. Your intellect becomes one with the intellect of the Torah. This is the distinctive, infinitely great and wonderful superiority of the mitzvah of knowing and comprehending Torah. Focuses of knowing, understanding, comprehending the Torah. Al kol mitzvah is maisius. Over all the mitzvahs involving action. Va'afilu al mitzvahs atluyas b'dibur. Not only mitzvahs involving action, but even mitzvahs over those performed through speech. Va'afilu al mitzvahs talmud Torah sheb'dibur. Indeed, even over the mitzvahs of the oral Torah study. What is he saying here? We explained in the past that when you study the Torah, there is studying the written law, for example, the Torah shebiksav. When one studies the Torah shebiksav, the written law, you are fulfilling the mitzvah of studying the Torah even if you do not understand it. You just read the words of Torah, you're fulfilling mitzvah of the Torah because there's the holiness in the words of the Torah. And therefore, you say the bracha before you read the Torah, even if you don't understand it. That is the idea of being called up to the Torah. You're getting aliyah to the Torah. You say the bracha before. Why? Because this is part of the studying of the Torah, is saying the words. but it does not have the same advantage as when you study the Torah and understanding the Torah. Because this unity that happens when you understand the Torah and when you work hard and your mind is in the Torah study, then your mind becomes one with the Torah, and the Torah becomes one with you. You encompassing, you're surrounding the thoughts, the idea, the godly thoughts, and the thought is in you. At the same time, you are in the Torah. Your mind is in that thought, in the godly thoughts. Continues the Alter Rebbe. So therefore, it is an advantage even on the Torah study, which is through just saying the words of Torah. For although through all the mitzvahs performed in action and speech, HaKadosh Baruch Hu malbish es hanefesh umakifa oir Hashem meroisha ve'ad. God clothes the soul and envelops it with his light from head to foot, from the highest level to the lowest level. Anytime you do a mitzvah, you're being encompassed by Hashem, embraced by Hashem. But when we study the Torah, when we know the Torah, when knowledge of the Torah is more than just that. While in the case of knowledge of Torah, milvad she'aseichel melubesh bechochmas Hashem, hinei gam chochmas Hashem bekirbei. Apart from the intellect being clothed in, enveloped by divine wisdom, the divine wisdom is also within him, so that he envelops it. Masha seichel masig v'teifes u'makiv b'sichloi, masha efshaloi lispeg l'asig medias ha'Torah. Through his intellect comprehending, grasping, and encompassing whatever Torah knowledge it is capable of grasping and comprehending. Each according to his intellect and his capacity of knowledge and understanding in Pardes, the four modes of Torah interpretation, Pshat, Remez, Drush, Soid, the simple understanding, the Remez, which is the hint, the Remez is the part of the Torah that alludes to things. Drush is the drash, like the medrash. When Soit is the esoteric part of the Torah. All these parts of the Torah, whatever a person is capable of understanding in his level, the person becomes united in these both two ways that we just said. Now the Alter Rebbe goes on to explain that because this is something, knowing the Torah, learning the Torah, is something that you are being not only encompassed by the Torah, and not only being in the Torah, but the Torah is in you. The knowledge of the Torah is in you. This is why the Torah is referred to as the bread and the food for the soul. Just like bread and the food goes in you, here the Torah goes in you. This is the Alter Rebbe. Ulefi shebiyedias ha-Torah. Ha-Torah melubeshes ben-nefesh ha-adam v'sichlo yemukefes b'seicham. Since through the knowledge of Torah, the Torah is absorbed in the soul, and the intellect of the person is encompassed within them. It is therefore called the bread and food of the soul. King Solomon says, if your enemy is hungry, feed them bread. Our sages tell us what that means. If your enemy is hungry, Meaning, if the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, your enemy comes and is hungry, you got to feed him bread. What is the bread? The bread is the Torah. Give him the Torah. Go and study Torah, and you'll see how this will bring cure. So he says, just as the physical bread nourishes the body. When does it nourish the body? Not when you have bread on the table. When it is ingested and absorbed within it, within the body. And when it is transformed there in the body into blood and flesh of one's own flesh. And only then will the body live and be sustained. When you absorb it and you becomes one with you. This is the idea of the Torah. The Torah also, what is like the bread. When you absorb the Torah and it becomes one with you, then it feeds you, gives you life. And obviously it has to be done in the right way. Just like bread. What is bread made out of? Bread is made out of flour and water. Especially when you want to go with the healthy bread, you want to avoid all the cholesterol, the eggs, and the other things like Tipi does with the beautiful, delicious whole wheat bread, only flour and water. But if you take flour and water and you're going to put it in your stomach, what's going to happen? It's not going to give you life. It's not going to give you health. Only going to cause some damage, God forbid. What do you need to do? You have to warm it up. You have to have the warmth of the oven. You have to heat it up. Same thing when you study the Torah. You study the Torah, it has to be a study of Torah for the sake of Hashem. When you study Torah and for the wrong reasons, God forbid, it can cause damage. You get the person to become arrogant. And like it says, Nasa Sam becomes it can be like a poison in a way. But if you study the Torah the right way, you bring the heat of Hashem, the holiness of it, the neshama of the Torah, and you study the Torah and you ingest it, you bring it inside you, it becomes part of you, and becomes part of your flesh and blood, and then it gives you life. Continues the Alter Rebbe. When you study the Torah, similarly through the knowledge and comprehension of Torah by the soul of a person who studied it well, with concentration of his intellect, to the point where the Torah is grasped by his mind and is joined with him so that they become one. The Torah thereby becomes food for the soul. And it becomes an inner life for it. From the fountainhead of life, the blessed Ein Sof, who is clothed in his wisdom and the Torah that are in the soul of the Torah student. This is the meaning of the verse. Your Torah is in my inner parts. Meaning that Torah is food for the soul. This is from the Tehillim and Psalms. It is similar written in Eitz Chaim, Portal 44, chapter 3, that mitzvahs are the garments of the soul in paradise, in Gan Eden. The Torah, on the other hand, is the food for the souls in paradise. And the neshamas which had engaged in Torah study for its own sake. That we said in Torah, we study Torah, not just studying Torah for its own sake. during their life on this earth. It is similarly written in the Zohar. Vayakel, page 210. And now what does it mean to study Torah for its own sake? Velishma, hainu lekasha nafshel Hashem aledei asagas haTorah. The meaning of Torah study for its own sake is study with the intent of binding one's soul to God by comprehending the Torah. Now, when you study the Torah and you comprehend the Torah and you do it for the sake of uniting with God, this becomes food to you. Each man according to the capacity of the intellect, as explained in Pri Eitz Chaim. And finally, here the Alter Rebbe addresses another question. And we just said that the Torah is food, and the mitzvahs are considered the garments. When you come to the mitzvah, when it comes to going in Gan Eden, you need to have both. You need to have the garments and you need to have the food. Question is, which one is greater? Which one is in a higher level? Is the mitzvahs in a higher level? Is the garments in a higher level? Or the food is in a higher level? On one end, you can say each one has its own advantage. If the food becomes part of your life, what is the garments? The garments represent something which is encompassing you. But the idea of something that is encompassing you has also an advantage. In the Chassidus, in the Kabbalah, it's considered something which is above you, something that cannot enter internally. So it seems like there's, in a way, an advantage in the mitzvahs, which is considered the levushim. Says the Alter Rebbe, you know what? In the Torah study, you have both. You have both. It is the inner part, inner light, and also becomes the levushim, the garments. So it says, the food of the soul refers to the level of inward, indwelling light. The garment refers to the level of encompassing light. For this reason, our sages said that the Torah study is equal to all other mitzvahs combined. Because the mitzvahs are garments alone. While the Torah is food and also garments for the intellectual soul. Because Torah serves as a garment because one clothes himself within it by his soul's concentration on it and study of it. How much more so if one expresses the words of Torah orally. So when you have the expressing it orally and understanding, you have both advantages. The breath of the speech becomes a kind of encompassing light, as it is written in the Pri Eitz Chaim. We thus see that the Torah study possesses the quality of both food and garments. It is thus superior to all other mitzvahs, which are garments alone. The being connected with the Torah is becoming one with the Torah. And therefore, this is what the Alter Rebbe teaches us in this chapter 5, which is in a way digressing from the whole structure of the Tanya in this beginning of the Tanya with the chapters. When the Alter Rebbe explained all of the faculties and the garments of the godly soul. So the Alter Rebbe dedicated a whole chapter to understand what is really the great level of understanding the study of the Torah. And tomorrow we'll continue in the Tanya, where the Alter Rebbe starts to explain the garments or the makeup and the structure of the animalistic soul. So thank you all for joining today, and join us in Mirz Hashem tomorrow, 9:10 a.m. Any questions we can take now?